I never imagined a 6-foot cedar fence could ignite a war. But in Cedar Hills Estates, a community manicured to the brink of soulless perfection, it wasn't the fence itself that caused the problem. It was that I, Tom Granger, built it without kissing the ring of our local tyrants, the HOA board. I'd moved to Cedar Hills for peace. After serving 20 years in the Marines and retiring honorably, all I wanted was a quiet life with my wife, 2 dogs, and a backyard where I could sip beer and grill steaks on Saturdays. We bought the corner lot because it gave us just a little more land than the others. Room for a garden, a hammock, and yes, a privacy fence. I read the HOA rules. Every last soul-sucking line of that 124-page document. Nowhere did it say I couldn't replace the old, rotting chain-link fence with something solid and tasteful. So when I got the permits from the county and hired a licensed contractor, I figured I was in the clear. I wasn't. The trouble started 3 days after the fence was completed. I came home from a hardware run to find a bright orange notice of non-compliance duct taped to my front door like some kind of scarlet letter. Written in all caps, the letter claimed I had violated Section 12A, Aesthetic Harmony and Fencing Structures, a vague clause often used by the HOA to harass residents. The name at the bottom of the letter was one I would come to know all too well. Judith Cartwright, the HOA president. Judith was the kind of woman who made a hobby out of tyranny. Short, always dressed in pale pink suits, and with a glare sharp enough to crack concrete, she wielded the HOA handbook like a Bible. Rumor had it she fined a neighbor $200 because their Christmas lights went up before Thanksgiving. At first, I tried to be civil. I called her. "Hello, Judith. This is Tom Granger, over on Red Maple Way. I got your letter about the fence. You didn't submit the architectural review form," she snapped before I could finish. I read the CC and RS. It doesn't say... It says you must maintain community standards and seek board approval before structural changes to exterior property. It's a fence. And now it's a violation. I clenched my jaw. "Judith, I have a permit. The fence is within property lines, and frankly, it looks better than half the fences in this neighborhood. You'll need to remove it within 7 days or face fines." Then she hung up. I didn't remove the fence. I also didn't pay the fine. That's when the letters started coming in weekly, then daily. Threats of liens, legal action, and disciplinary escalation. My mailbox was more HOA than mail. I reached out to my lawyer buddy, Rick, who looked over the HOA's bylaws and county regulations. His conclusion? They're bluffing. Your permit is valid. They don't have legal grounds unless the bylaws explicitly prohibit cedar or 6-foot height. And they don't. I wrote a formal letter of rebuttal and sent it certified. 2 days later, I came home to find my fence gone. Not just removed, demolished. Sawn posts, crushed panels, and splinters of wood lay scattered like battlefield debris. There were tire tracks in my yard from heavy equipment, and my garden, my wife's pride and joy, was flattened. I thought it was a robbery, maybe vandalism. But then I found a second notice on my porch. This time, it wasn't orange. It was crimson red, a final enforcement action signed again by Judith Cartwright. HOA enforcement had bulldozed my fence. I saw red. I took photos, called the sheriff's department, filed a report, and then I made a call to Rick. "They destroyed private property," I said through gritted teeth. "Without a court order, without a legal right." Rick's voice was calm but electric. They messed up, Tom. Big time. The next day, we filed a civil suit. When someone wrongs you bad enough, there's a switch that flips in your brain. It's not about anger anymore. It's about justice. And I was locked into that gear, full throttle. Rick didn't waste time. The morning after the fence demolition, we filed a civil lawsuit for destruction of private property, trespassing, and intentional emotional distress. Not just against the HOA, but personally against Judith Cartwright and the enforcement contractor she hired without a municipal permit. And here's the kicker. There were security camera recordings. I had installed a Ring camera above my garage just 2 months earlier, mostly to keep an eye on porch pirates. But it turned out to be the golden goose. The footage showed a large black truck with Cedar Hills compliance team on the door rolling into my driveway, a crew in reflective vests hopping out, and within 10 minutes, they started ripping the fence apart, with no warrant, no sheriff, and no notice to me. Rick's grin when he saw the video, Tom, they just gave us a legal nuke. The first legal step was to get a restraining order. Yes, you heard that right, against the HOA itself. It barred them from stepping foot on my property without express written consent or an escort from law enforcement. Then we went public. Rick contacted a friend at the local news station, a fiery reporter named Melanie Park, who loved a David versus Goliath story. That night, my security footage ran on the 6 o'clock news under the headline, Veterans Fence Demolished by HOA Without Notice or Permission. I couldn't even finish dinner that evening. My phone exploded with calls, texts, emails. Neighbors dropped by. People I barely knew were outraged. Some had similar stories. A woman down the street said her flower beds had been weeded by the HOA because they weren't native species. Another guy said he'd been fined $100 a day for parking his motorcycle on his own driveway. I wasn't alone. 3 days later, Judith Cartwright called me directly. Her voice was tight. "You've made a spectacle of our community, Mr. Granger." "You bulldozed my fence," I replied. "The board was within its rights." "No, you weren't. And we'll let a judge decide that." There was a pause. Then she said something that would later bite her in the courtroom. "We've dealt with louder people than you, Mr. Granger. And we always win." Click. That recording? I had it saved too. The court date was set for May 14th. Just 4 weeks away, but the HOA wasn't content to wait. A week before the hearing, I received another notice. This time, they claimed I had unauthorized construction materials in my yard. You know what those were? The broken pieces of the fence they had destroyed, which I hadn't yet cleaned up because it was being used as evidence. They wanted to fine me $250 per day until it was cleared. I laughed so hard I nearly spit coffee through my nose. But Rick, he wasn't laughing. He was furious. He amended the lawsuit to include retaliatory action and harassment. Then something magical happened. The county building inspector showed up on my property, this time with me there. He'd been anonymously tipped off, probably by Judith, that I was storing hazardous debris. But instead of citing me, he looked at the splinters and smiled. "This fence was professionally installed," he said. "Code's fine. It was even double stabilized." He turned to me. "You know, I got HOA complaints all week about this street. And funny thing is, all their records, their enforcement permits, work contracts, jurisdiction approvals, they're missing. You could have knocked me over with a feather." Rick and I dug in deeper. Turns out the Cedar Hills HOA had been operating outside its legal authority for years. They never refiled their charter with the county 3 years ago after restructuring, which meant everything they'd done since then, including demolishing my fence, was legally null and void. Now we weren't just looking at property damage. We were looking at HOA charter violations, unauthorized use of force, operating as a governing body without legal authority, abuse of power against multiple residents. We collected 6 more affidavits from neighbors who had similar experiences, and we turned the lawsuit into a class action. Judith must have gotten wind of it, because suddenly flyers started appearing around the neighborhood. Save Cedar Hills, defend your HOA from outside attacks. The gall. But no one was buying it. By the time our first court hearing rolled around, I wasn't alone in that courtroom. There were 11 of us, plus an angry crowd outside, waving signs like "Down with HOA tyranny" and "Let us live in peace." The morning of the court hearing, the air felt charged. Not the kind of nervous tension you get before a dentist visit, but the heavy electric kind that rolls through the sky before a thunderstorm. My wife handed me a thermos of black coffee, kissed my cheek, and whispered, "Let 'em have it, Maureen." The county courthouse was busier than usual for a civil hearing. News crews parked outside. Residents from Cedar Hills filled the gallery. Even folks from neighboring communities showed up just to watch the spectacle. Inside, Judith Cartwright sat stiffly at the defendant's table, flanked by 2 HOA board members and a sour-faced lawyer named Frank Densler. He had the smug air of a man used to winning by technicalities. But this wasn't going to be his usual day. Judge Meredith Allen, a no-nonsense woman with sharp eyes and an iron voice, called the room to order. "Mr. Granger," she said, glancing at the thick binder of evidence Rick had submitted, "you are alleging property destruction, harassment, and unlawful conduct by the Cedar Hills Homeowners Association. Is that correct?" Rick rose, nodded. "Yes, Your Honor, and not just to Mr. Granger. We now represent 11 plaintiffs under a joint class action." Frank Densler scoffed. "Your Honor, this is a simple zoning miscommunication. The fence was removed per enforcement protocol, without a court order, without a valid charter," Rick interrupted smoothly, "and using contractors with no legal permits to operate heavy machinery on residential property." He laid out the timeline, the certified permits, the ring footage, the restraining order violations, the retaliatory fines, and the county's own admission that the HOA hadn't re-registered their governing charter. Then came the security footage. We played it for the court, loud and clear. The sound of motors ripping wood, boots trampling over my flower beds. Judith didn't flinch. She just stared ahead, arms crossed tightly over her pink blazer. When the tape ended, Judge Allen turned to Frank Densler. "Do you have any explanation, counsel?" He stood. "Your Honor, we acted in what we believed was the best interest of community standards. We had every reason to believe—" "You had no standing," she snapped. "No registered charter means no legal authority. You were just neighbors playing government with a wrecking crew." Then she turned to me. "Mr. Granger, you are a veteran, correct?" "Yes, Your Honor," she nodded. "Thank you for your service. You didn't deserve this." The room went still. Then she laid down her ruling. The verdict. The HOA was found liable for destruction of private property, trespassing, emotional distress, retaliatory harassment, operating without a valid legal charter. The The court awarded me $75,000 in damages. The HOA was ordered to pay legal fees for all plaintiffs, over $130,000. The HOA's operations were officially suspended pending county review. And most satisfying of all, I was granted a temporary injunction allowing court-ordered demolition of the HOA's main enforcement office, the very office from which Judith had issued fines, threats, and that crimson letter. I didn't smile in the courtroom, but I was smiling on the inside like the devil himself. The story hit the evening news again. The headline this time, "Veteran wins court battle, HOA ordered to shut down and pay damages." Somehow it was sweeter the second time around. I wasn't done yet. It was poetic, really. 1 month after the court ruling, I stood in front of the very same HOA building where Judith Cartwright had signed the demolition order for my fence. Only this time, I had the power, and I had something much bigger than a hired crew. I had a county-issued demolition permit, a court order, and a full construction team ready to flatten that smug little building they called the Cedar Hills Compliance Office. I wore my old Marine Corps cap that morning. Judith was there too, of course, standing across the lawn with her arms folded, flanked by the 2 remaining board members and a couple of angry HOA loyalists. Her lips were pressed into a straight line and her eyes were full of venom. She tried to argue with the foreman as the excavator rolled in. "This is an abuse of power," she hissed. He calmly held up the signed court order. "Ma'am, you had your day in court. This order's from a judge. You want to stop it, take it up with her." The first crunch. The excavator's arm swung with a mechanical growl and punched through the front wall like it was made of wet paper. The sound of cracking drywall and splintering wood echoed across the cul-de-sac. It felt like karma had roared to life in steel and diesel. People came out of their homes, some filming, others cheering. Even Melanie Park, the local reporter, was back with her camera crew, capturing every glorious second. I stood in silence, hands in my pockets, as the roof collapsed inward. That little office had been the source of so much anxiety, pain, and intimidation for the entire community. And now, it was dust. The fallout. The Cedar Hills HOA didn't survive the blow. With the office gone, the board scattered. Judith was forced to resign within 2 weeks after a vote of no confidence. Turns out, once neighbors realized how much of their dues had been used for legal battles, under-the-table fines, and unauthorized construction, the tide turned fast. Some residents wanted the HOA abolished altogether. Others wanted it rebuilt from scratch, transparently, with real checks and balances. I didn't care either way. I just wanted my peace, and I finally had it. My new fence was taller, stronger, and sealed with a fresh coat of redwood stain. I put a wooden plaque on it that read, "Protected by court order. Come closer if you need a reminder." My neighbors laughed, but no one touched that fence again. And Judith? Well, Judith tried to move out quietly, listed her home for sale, packed a U-Haul late one evening. But word travels fast in neighborhoods like ours. As she drove out of the cul-de-sac, someone had planted a sign on her lawn. It read, "HOA Queen Dethroned. May your next kingdom have real rules." I didn't plant that sign, but I'll be honest, I framed it and hung it in my garage. After the dust settled, literally and figuratively, our cul-de-sac felt different. For the first time in years, people actually talked to each other without looking over their shoulders. Lawn chairs popped up in front yards. Kids rode bikes down the street without being barked at for chalk drawings. There were no citations for mailbox colors or grass height, just peace. I started holding Saturday cookouts. Nothing fancy, burgers, dogs, cold beers, but neighbors came out like it was the 4th of July every week. We even welcomed families who used to keep their heads down, scared of Judith's wrath. One of them, the Halstons, came up to me after one cookout. The husband, Brian, shook my hand with a grip that spoke volumes. "You didn't just stand up for yourself," he said. "You stood up for all of us." That hit me harder than I expected, because for the first time, I realized this wasn't just revenge. It was redemption. A new chapter. The class action settlement checks came in weeks later. Every plaintiff in the lawsuit got compensated. Some used the money to repaint their homes. Others started repairs they'd been putting off for years because of HOA rejections. I used mine to start a veteran home repair fund, a local grant system for elderly or disabled vets who needed help maintaining their homes. It was funded by the HOA's legal loss. Sweet, sweet irony. And then came the surprise twist. The property files. One morning, Rick, my attorney and now good friend, called me up. "You sitting down?" he asked. "Go ahead." Turns out the land the HOA enforcement office was sitting on, it was never properly transferred to their ownership. It was leased, temporarily, from the county 20 years ago, and the lease expired. I blinked. So they didn't even own the land? Nope. Which means when the office was bulldozed, it legally counted as removal of unauthorized structures from county property. I laughed so hard I dropped my coffee. Judith Cartwright had leveled my fence for violating property aesthetics on land I owned. And I had demolished her fake kingdom from property her HOA didn't even legally possess. One last visit. A few weeks later, I visited the now empty lot where the HOA office once stood. Grass had already started growing over the cracked concrete. A single rusted bolt stuck out of the ground like a tooth knocked loose in a bar fight. I planted a wooden marker in the dirt. Nothing big, just a post with a small sign that said, "This is where tyranny went to die." As I stood there, the wind picked up, and I swear, just for a second, I heard the sound of a lawnmower revving in the distance, followed by Judith Cartwright's voice screeching about code violations. Then silence. Peace. Real peace. 6 months after the dust had settled, Cedar Hills was nearly unrecognizable. Not because of new paint or spruced-up flower beds, but because of the way people carried themselves. Gone were the stiff hellos and cautious glances over hedges. Now, neighbors shared garden tools, helped repair fences, and waved like it actually meant something. And despite what people might have expected, the neighborhood didn't fall apart without the HOA. It thrived. The vote that changed everything with the old HOA dissolved, residents held an open forum at the local rec center. No board members, no power-hungry elites, just people. And in a 67-3 vote, Cedar Hills decided to reform the HOA as a voluntary neighborhood council, stripped of fine authority and enforcement power. No more secret meetings. No more threats in the mail. We called it the Neighborhood Circle. Its mission, community support, shared tools, and volunteer-led beautification, not policing. And believe it or not, people actually wanted to join. Judith's legacy word had it Judith moved to a condo 3 towns over with strict HOA rules and a 400-page manual. Some said she tried to get on their board. Some said they laughed her out of the room. I never confirmed it. Didn't have to. Her name was now a neighborhood cautionary tale, like a ghost story for kids. Be nice or Judith will come back and find your azaleas. The fence that started it. All my fence still stood, solid and proud, like a symbol of resistance. But one day I made a quiet change. I replaced the plaque. Instead of the snarky warning, the new one read, "This land is free. Let's keep it that way." Neighbors noticed. Some even teared up. It wasn't just about property anymore. It was about belonging, about reclaiming what a few tyrants had stolen with paperwork and arrogance. So if you're listening to this and you're staring down your own HOA nightmare, wondering if you should fight back, let me tell you this. Yes, fight. Not out of spite, but out of principle. Because your home is your haven. No one gets to bulldoze your peace of mind. And if you play it smart, if you play it legal, you just might get to bulldoze theirs right back.